Philosophy and spirituality, postmodernism. Postmodernism is in contemporary discourse a very important intellectual entity. We see a renewed interest in postmodernism today. The renewed interest is because postmodernism is the philosophical foundation of wokeism, which has become a political force in Western democracies. Especially wokeism, which is not only a political force, not only a social activism movement, but also a largely gender-centered movement. And given strong activism and power capture and fundamental change in social cultural norms and the language of discourse it tries to bring about, because of wokeism coming to the center of society, supporters of wokeism and opponents of wokeism both want to know the philosophical foundations of wokeism, which happens to be postmodernism, and so the renewed interest in postmodernism. Historically, the word postmodernism was first used, to the best of recorded history that we have, around 1842 by someone by the name John Watkins, if I am not mistaken, but open to correction there. We also see postmodernism used very famously by Arnold Toynbee in his writing around 1939-40, where he took a review of early 20th century and he took station in the period just before First World War and saw there the beginning of traces of postmodernism. In the French artistic scene, much before Arnold Toynbee, postmodernism became a style that, in contradistinction to Impressionism, came up as distinct from Impressionism. After Toynbee, we see what we call postmodernism developing very rapidly across all areas of arts and architecture. In architecture, postmodern architecture came up in distinction to the modern architecture with a movement away from orthogonality and the straight curves of modern architecture, and postmodern lines which were non-orthogonal, and a re-entry of a free and flowing ornamentalism, which was not a replay of ancient ornamentalism, but came up in its postmodern flavor that became the parts of a large movement of postmodernism in architecture. The real development of postmodernism across disciplines of humanities essentially happened in 50s and 60s, and 60s was the era where it actually developed and found a very firm foundation in the intellectual world. In the philosophical world, very different from the world of arts, architecture, and literature, in the philosophical world, postmodernism was considered, looked at, deeply analyzed, and was found largely unsatisfactory and uninteresting and without much potential, and therefore it could not become a favorite of the philosophical world and was discarded very soon. One of the reasons was what postmodernism essentially is. Unlike other philosophies which have a clear founder, clear set of axioms, and a clear set of concepts, and then the deductions from the core concepts, postmodernism is not that kind of a philosophy. Postmodernism is actually a kind of a salad bowl where you have a collection of ideas and beliefs without any central point around which you find coherence. It is not a philosophy with a clear axiomatic foundation, clear core concepts, and then deduction from those core concepts. It doesn't put up the claims of being internally consistent. It doesn't put up the claim of being rigorous in a logical sense. It doesn't put up claims to have a core idea around which coherence exists. So it is more of a salad bowl of ideas and beliefs. Philosophy, the area of philosophy rejected postmodernism very soon. However, those outside of philosophy did not know about it, or they were not so well read in philosophy or appreciative of the history of philosophy. So despite postmodernism being discarded by philosophy, it continued to enjoy great respect in the intellectual world, especially in literature, gender studies, and arts. Postmodernism here shares some commonalities with rationalism. Postmodernism and rationalism both had very short duration admiration in the world of philosophy. Both of them were considered, discussed thoroughly, and discarded. However, outside of the philosophical world, rationalism and postmodernism continued to enjoy great popularity, much of it because those outside the world of philosophy never knew the reasons why philosophy did not find rationalism and postmodernism of enduring interest. Postmodernism was severely criticized for not respecting empiricism enough, values of enlightenment enough, for its relativism and nihilism, and in a convoluted way, it was going back to the pre-modern era of what I feel, what I believe, and what is my faith. The scientific community and the philosophical community never were impressed with either rationalism or postmodernism. However, the world of activism, the world of politics, the world of social discourse was fascinated by both these terms and continues to be fascinated by rationalism and modernism, although both have been discarded in the world of philosophy with very deep reflection. Postmodernism, as the word suggests, is this salad bowl of ideas and beliefs that follows modernism, that succeeds, or rather, let me say not succeeds, but comes after modernism. Just as modernism came in contradistinction to Christianity, postmodernism came in contradistinction to modernity, and it is as an antithesis of modernity that postmodernism constitutes itself. Everyone today is interested in postmodernism because it's the foundation of wokeism, and everyone wants to know, regardless of whether one is supporter of or opponent, what is it at the foundation of wokeism? And there you find postmodernism, and everyone therefore wants to know about postmodernism. Let us first look at what is this creature called postmodernism. If you were to deconstruct this postmodernism, what is it about? If you talk of postmodernism as a salad bowl, what are the constituents of this salad bowl? Postmodernism constitutes itself as an antithesis of modernism. So it's necessary to know what is modernism before we go to postmodernism. Modernism is the philosophical ism of last 250 years, ever since Enlightenment and Industrial Revolution. Modernism set itself up in contradistinction to the Christian world as antithesis of Christianity. So just as modernism set itself up as antithesis of the Christian world, postmodernism sets itself up as an antithesis of modernism. What are the bases of modernism? Let's go into it. The first pillar of modernism was belief in empirical science. So when it came to empirical science versus faith, modernism deposited its trust in empirical science. When it was empirical science versus intuitive knowledge or mystical knowledge or spiritual knowledge, modernism deposited its faith in empirical science. On the question of individualism versus collectivism, modernism sided with individualism. One of the core pursuits of human existence from standpoint of modernism was the pursuit of pleasure, maximization of pleasure or hedonism. So third pillar of modernism was hedonism. Fourth pillar of modernism was a belief in a linear march of history. When we look at the journey of history, there are various ways of assessing and understanding what is the nature of this journey of history. Modernism believes in the linear march of history, very different from the Hindu worldview. The Hindu worldview or the Hindu schools look at it very differently. Hindu schools look at the journey of history from point of view of not linearity but circularity. That the same things repeat over and over again. Some Hindu schools look at the march of history in terms of upwardly moving spiral, that there are ups and downs in the spiral, but on an average, it's an upwardly moving spiral. Some schools look at circularity within upwardly moving spirality, and some schools look at linearity within circularity within the upwardly moving spirality. Modernism believes in the linear march of history, that we are moving towards a destination, and once we reach the correct destination, it will be forever a good time to come, or at least forever an optimum destination we have reached. Modernism is also based on materialism and atheism. Since modernism set itself up as antithesis of Christianity, materialism and atheism are very central to modernism. The last 250 years of modernism also is the age of meta-narratives, the age of ideology. So we see during the phase of modernism, the era, the historical period of modernism, we see ideologies like capitalism, communism, environmentalism, feminism coming up. If we go deeper at the foundations of modernity itself, even deeper than what we have talked till now, modernism itself is a product of Western civilization. And Western civilization essentially thinks in terms of what is called singularism. So the bedrock of thinking of Western civilization is singularism. Singularism means there is one truth. I know the truth, or I can find the truth. If you don't believe what I believe, it is my duty to bring you to the right path, if necessary by use of lure, fear, or violence. So singularism is a binary pursuit of truth. All Western thinking, whether it is modernism, Christianity, Judaism, Islam, environmentalism, feminism, including wokeism, all of them come from the same foundation of singularism, that there is one truth. In wokeism, ironically, the truth is that there is no objective truth. That becomes the the truth of singularism. So the ideology for wokeism is there is no ideology, that is the ideology. So the entire Western thinking is based upon singularism. Contradistinction to this is the Hindu approach of pluralism, which says there are many truths and you have a right to believe or not to believe, and if to believe, any way you wish to believe. The foundation of singularism and pluralism gives rise to very different civilizations, very different thought processes, very different spirituality, very different culture. Modernism and postmodernism both are outcomes of singularism. Therefore, wokeism also is an outcome of the same singularism. Wokeism tries to move towards pluralism, but the moment it has to deal with those who don't believe in wokeism, you see the full force of singularism coming up. So it professes in content pluralism, but it fights with the fanaticism of singularism. It does not tolerate a contrary conservative ideology. So it is plural in claims, but singular in its fight. In a way, it is half plural, half singular. So postmodernism constitutes itself as an antithesis of modernism, just as modernism constituted itself as an antithesis of Christianity. This is a negative definition of postmodernism, that it is not what modernism stood for, just as modernism was not what Christianity stood for. Let us now come to the positive definition of postmodernism. If you deconstruct the term, what are the defining characteristics of postmodernism? The first characteristic that defines postmodernism is rejection of all meta-narratives and therefore rejection of all meta-ideologies. So there is a rejection of capitalism, communism, and all similar meta-narratives, which includes all religions. So there is a rejection of all religions, all ideologies, all meta-narratives. Postmodernism says that there is no overarching single theory that satisfactorily can explain everything, and therefore there is no one theory to follow. So there is a rejection of all religions, of all ideologies, all meta-narratives. Second characteristic is the gender-centeredness of the later part of postmodernism, not the early part. What we see today, we see gender-centeredness of postmodernism in the form of wokeism. Gender comes to the center stage, at least in the present contemporary expression of modernism, which is wokeism. There is a break from everything that was in modernity. So that break is a self-constitution by antithesis. So whether we talk in terms of postmodernism in music or architecture or painting, it essentially is an antithesis of what existed before postmodernism started. So in a way, it is antithesis of the pre-existing in every area where postmodernism expresses itself. The fourth characteristic is of absolute and instantaneous subjectivity. What you feel at any moment is enough for you to believe in and do actions by. So if you feel on a Tuesday you are a woman, you are a woman. On Friday, if you feel you are a man, you are a man. At 4 o'clock, if you feel you are a woman, you are a woman. At 5 o'clock, if you feel you are a man, you are a man. So there is an absolute instantaneous subjectivity which is respected, and what you feel is enough. You don't have to give any empirical proof, any empirical validation, or any logical explanation. Your feeling is enough for you to believe and act by. The fourth element is centrality of the concepts of power, hierarchy, privilege, and operation. This is a borrowing from Marxism. It is also a borrowing from Adler's view of human nature, that central to society is power, which gives rise to hierarchy, and it brings about the social phenomena of privilege and oppression. And therefore, the postmodern objective is to fight these power structures in society, dismantle these hierarchies, these structures which are created in society leading to privilege and oppression. So there is a constant fight against oppression in all situations, whether it is family, school, college, government, military, and a genuine quest to believe in privilege, in the abolition of all forms of privilege. There is also this belief of self-assignment or social assignment versus naturalism. So this is a complete antithesis of naturalism. The belief is there is nothing hardwired, there is nothing scientifically objective in human nature. Everything is an assignment. Either we assign it to ourselves or somebody assigns it. So gender also is an assignment. It's not natural. It is like behaviorism taken to the extreme, the philosophy of tabula rasa taken to the extreme. The belief is I create myself every moment, either by my own dictates or by subtle dictates of society, which I internalize and abide by. So there is a idea of assignment rather than anything being objective or natural. When it goes into activism, it believes in breaking of every structure. It's almost like a westernized contemporary form of what Mao used to say in China, a perpetual cultural revolution. That any form that stabilizes ultimately becomes reactionary. It develops its hierarchy, power, privilege, and oppression. And therefore, there needs to be a perpetual breaking down of every structure, a perpetual contesting of all stability, all stable ideas, a perpetual contesting of all power structures. And this perpetual cultural revolution, although Wokism does not use this phrase, but this is what actually it is. It's a contemporary westernized form of what Mao used to call a perpetual cultural revolution. That there has to be a perpetual contest against all structures that try to stabilize themselves, because any stable structure ultimately creates power, hierarchy, privilege, and oppression. Wokism has become of interest, and because of that, postmodernism has become of interest, not because of theory, but because of activism. Because the activist form of Wokism is to occupy power. And their ideology is that there is no ideology and this is the only ideology. So no ideology is their ideology. One has to say here a few words about any ideology in general. There is no ideology which is not good in terms of one element, that it is an attempt to reduce suffering. or abolish suffering. In that sense, wokeism is as good as any other ideology. That wokeism and postmodernism both try to remove or minimize suffering. The difficulty comes in terms of their assessment of what causes suffering and the solution they provide. So the difficulty is in terms of postmodernism and wokeism, the difficulty is in analysis of causality and the solution they prescribe, not in terms of the intent or the goal. The goal always is to have a better world. The intent always is to reduce suffering. Problem arises when the assessment of suffering and the solution proposed by any philosophy is seen by a competing philosophy as neither being a correct analysis of causation and the solution proposed likely to bring in more suffering, not less. So that is where the contest of ideologies happen. By definition, wokeism and postmodernism, especially postmodernism, by definition, postmodernism cannot have a coherent theory because it cannot become a meta-narrative itself, because one of the founding principles is rejection of all meta-narratives, and therefore you cannot create a very systematic, coherent philosophy of postmodernism. Postmodernism, by definition, remains a salad ball of ideas and beliefs. So there is no one coherent theory which is called postmodernism. It is a collection of ideas and beliefs, most of which are not coherent with each other and cannot be reduced to a common center. So this is what postmodernism is. Now let us look at the evolution of postmodernism. What is the philosophical evolution of this philosophy of postmodernism, if you can call it a philosophy? Most people do call it a philosophy. Postmodernism is a strange concoction of many other philosophies which preceded it in the history of philosophy. Let us take a look at which are the preceding philosophies in the history of philosophy, from which postmodernism has taken something or the other and constituted itself. So if we look at evolution of postmodernism, we have to go back into the history of philosophy. First station in the history of philosophy is the philosophy of Hume, David Hume, who brought in this discussion on tabula rasa, the idea that human mind at birth is a blank screen. And on that blank screen, experience writes the script. Postmodernism borrows this idea from David Hume that by birth, we are not born with any objective characteristics, any objective design for the program of life, or anything objective which cannot be erased and which has to be accepted and lived by. Especially in case of gender, postmodernism believes in gender being an assignment, not a natural scientific fact occurring by virtue of the hardware and the hardwired orientation at birth. So when postmodernism says everything is an assignment, belief, and self-creation, everything is a self-creation or a social creation, essentially they are referring to Hume's insistence or discussion, a detailed discussion of tabul rasa. Second important development in the history of philosophy was Kant's idea of thing in itself which cannot be known. So Immanuel Kant laid out limits of what can be known by the human mind and what is unknowable to the human mind. And Immanuel Kant said, when you look at anything, you can know it to the extent your sensory apparatus and your thinking apparatus permits it. The limits of your sensory apparatus and your thinking apparatus are limits of knowing, and there is a large unknowable about which we don't know anything. So whatever we know about whatever we see or experience, we can never be certain what it is in itself. So the thing in itself is unknowable. Not only unknowable, it's unintelligible. Discourse about thing in itself is fundamentally an unintelligible discourse. So the thing in itself cannot be completely known, and there are severe limits to what human beings can do. Postmodernism accepts this and takes this as one of the constituents of the elements in the salad bowl. One element in the salad bowl is the fundamental concept of tabul rasa. Second is thing in itself, where there is a rejection of any knowledge as being final and certain. The limitedness of human knowledge. The third element which goes into the salad bowl is Nietzsche's concept of God is dead and man is free. That human values are for human beings to make. There is no destination of destiny. There is no prescription from divinity. These values are for creating, and this freedom and absoluteness of human creation in the area of values and morality is another element in the salad bowl of postmodernism. Existentialism, the idea that postmodernism borrows is man is free but thrown into the world without God. That man is free, but he is thrown into this world without God. And in the godless world, we find ourselves in the condition of thrownness. That there is a contingency befalling us. There is a weight of circumstance befalling us, and we find ourselves in that thrown condition. The thrownness can be in a social order where we are oppressed and somebody else is privileged. And that situation is something we find ourselves in. We don't create it. We find ourselves thrown in that situation. So there is a thrownness to the human condition, to the human situation. And most people in the world find themselves thrown into the world of oppression and privilege, and they are on the side of oppression, where somebody else is privileged and they are being oppressed. Fifth delicacy in that bowl is post-structuralism. Just as postmodernism constituted itself as antithesis of modernism, post-structuralism, a philosophical movement, constituted itself as an antithesis of structuralism. Structuralism was a movement where from a few simple elementary entities, a structure was created, and those structures then created more complicated structures which finally dictated the phenomena in the world. So any phenomena could be understood in terms of underlying structures. It's almost like an atomic theory of the universe. Atomic not in the physical sense, but atomic in a conceptual sense, philosophical sense. Post-structuralism Postmodernism borrows heavily from post-structuralism in that it believes that you cannot have a structured explanation of society, human being, human life, or the universe or reality. And when it says rejection of all meta-narratives, it heavily includes rejection of all structural theories. My personal belief, just to put a word here, can't resist it. Between structuralism and post-structuralism, my personal belief is in open structuralism. Some other time I'll go into it. Sixth, postmodernism believes, rather draws liberally from linguistic philosophy, from work of Saussure and Wittgenstein, which says that words don't have an absolute meaning on their own. If you go into dictionary, there is a circularity. Word X is defined in terms of Y, Y in terms of Z, and Z again in terms of X. So there is a world of words where meanings derive themselves. And there is no absoluteness to language. So we see one more point before I make a greater meta point. Wittgenstein tried to plot the limits of knowability by plotting the limits of language. Just as Kant plotted the limits of knowability from the point of limits of our senses and our thinking apparatus, Wittgenstein tried to plot the limits of human knowability by plotting the limits of language, because human beings, he said, know only through language. If we look from point 1 to point 6 from Hume to Wittgenstein, we see a journey of the human mind conceding knowability, one parcel at a time at every step. For Hume, the absoluteness of knowledge was unattainable. The certitude of knowledge was unattainable. So the certitude was given up, not the knowledge itself. But uncertain knowledge was possible, certain knowledge was not possible. So the first surrender to the unknowable. It's almost like there is a contest between human mind and the unknowable. And the first surrender to the unknowable, the first parcel of land handed over to the unknowable, was that of certain knowledge. So the Hume, from the omnipotence before whom, Hume, the omnipotence that human beings can know everything there is to know, that all necessary knowledge is necessary. We slowly come to the point where we say all necessary knowledge is not necessary. Knowledge possible is knowledge sufficient. So Hume puts the first limit on our intellectual omnipotence. And he says there is nothing like certain knowledge, absolute and true forever, all times to come. So the first limit on human knowledge is put in Hume. One may agree or not agree, that's a different thing, but this is what Hume says. Kant put even stricter limits on what human beings can know. By the concept of thing in itself. And linguistic philosophy puts even further constraints of what can be known in language, which might well be much shorter than what the sensory and conceptual apparatus may be capable of. So from that position of absolute omnipotent knowing, we come to contingency, that what our senses and our thinking apparatus and our language allows us to know, that is all that is there to know. I mean, that is all that we can know. So we cannot know the whole of reality. We can know only what is allowed to us, and that is what is contingent upon us. So from reality to uncertain part of reality to the contingency as imposed upon us by the senses, by the limitations of senses and the thinking apparatus, to the contingency reducing further, almost contracting in terms of the capability and the possible extension of language. There is this continuously contracting contingency, which we are told we can at best know. So post-structuralism takes all these concepts in terms of severe limitations to our knowledge, severe limitations to the certitude of our knowledge, severe limitations to the absoluteness of our knowledge. The width, the depth, and the certitude all are limited. And therefore, there's nothing to really believe and live and die for. It's almost as though in the ideological currency market, it's an extremely fungible market with severe strengths and limitations to every currency. There is nothing sacred, holy, objective, eternal to really live and die for. Everything is a fungible currency to be used and possibly true in a limited context. Seventh element postmodernism draws from is Marxism. What it does is it gives up the political aspect of Marxism, the economic aspect of Marxism, but takes up the cultural aspect of Marxism. And it reinvents the cultural Marxism in terms of concepts of privilege, hierarchy, power, and oppression. And if you see 1 to 7, postmodernism as a salad bowl of ideas and beliefs which don't have a common axiomatic foundation or any coherent aligning idea at the center, Postmodernism then comes up as a strange concoction of Marxism, post-structuralism, linguistic philosophy, scholastic philosophy, existentialism, individualism, relativism, and nihilism. It's a strange concoction of all these isms. And obviously, many of these isms are mutually contesting isms. And therefore, you cannot find a conceptual center if you have to have this kind of a concoction. As Walt Whitman said, I am vast enough to contain contradictions. I behold multitudes. That is the descriptive, constitutive state of the philosophy of post-structuralism. This was about the philosophical evolution of post-structuralism. Now let us look at what post-structuralism is in action. Post-structuralism becomes interesting today, not because of post-structuralism as a philosophy, but because of its angry, aggressive child, narcissistic, fragile child called wokeism. And wokeism is extremely a socially activist political movement. And it works in a particular way. It has its own modus operandi. And the modus operandi is this. First, capture the intellectual centers, the university, the media, and the internet. So capture universities from inside. Create groups of faculty members and power holders. As much as it dislikes power, wokeism has no problem in using power for its own expansion and perpetuation. As much as it talks about pluralism, wokeism has no difficulty in using the fanatic force of singularism for its own establishment and perpetuation and to eliminate the opponents. It's the cancel culture. There is no question of tolerating pluralism. It's just cancelling anyone who does not agree. On that point, it's very singular. So first, capture the intellectual center points. Second, start with gender equality as a discourse in society. From there, move towards the idea of gender being an assignment. From there, move to gender being a feeling of instantaneous subjectivity. From there, move to create a fortress of law on the side of wokeism. Then move on to capture the corporates, which are the central players in today's society. From there, become political and occupy power, which you see in the Western countries. Once you capture power, you create policies and laws, which make it very costly for anyone not to agree with you. And once this is done, till point 7 you have come, then you really open an offensive against conservatism across the society. And this has a steep cost for anyone on the conservative side. It's almost as though the scales have been reversed. The minority rebel now is in the power, and once the conservative majority, now it's fighting for its own survival. The next step is to normalize wokeism. Thereafter, annihilate whatever conservatism is left and then try to perpetuate wokeism. So this is the 11-point modus operandi of wokeism, which is the angry, narcissistically fragile and hurt child of postmodernism. Before I go to the future, one remark I would like to make, that the causality of wokeism is not actually philosophical or gender rooted. The causality actually is psychological. We are seeing a generation of fragile narcissistic individuals with inchoate inane rage towards society, neighborhood, and schools that have failed them. And this inane, inchoate rage of a hurt, fragile narcissist is what is coming up on the surface as wokeism. It is really speaking the rage of a fragile narcissist. And the person is a narcissist, the person is fragile, and the person has rage. All the three characteristics are because of the breakdown of natural culture, the breakdown of family, and the breakdown of everything that is necessary for a healthy raising of a child. So it is a psychological phenomena that we are wrongly trying to fight as a political phenomenon, which of course as a political phenomena, those who are on the conservative side have to fight it. But it's necessary to understand the deeper aspects of wokeism, which are essentially psychological. And it has to do with the unnaturalness, the loss of archetypal rootedness, the loss of mythology, the loss of family, village, community, and hijacking of human mind by corporate communication and by corporate control. So everything that can go wrong in human culture has gone wrong. And I'm saying in the context of the Western civilization at present, not in the sense of anything related to biological survival, but things related to the cultural aspect of it. Let us now look at where postmodernism, wokeism, and the activism that it unleashes or it has unleashed, where it is leading. First, there is a split in the society, a very severe split. There is an aspect of majority and minority, a conservative majority versus a woke minority. And the woke minority is punching much above its weight, to use Jordan Peterson's term. From the side of postmodernism and wokeism, there is a severe underestimation of the strength, rationale, and utility of the fundamentals of conservatism. And because of that, conservatism, now under attack, has started uniting and fighting back. And the difficulty is, we might see a very crude and brutal religious revival and a social violence and purge, which we have not seen for the last many decades. And the violent reaction to this incessant and uncontrollable push by wokeism can lead to strong and severe and brutal and very violent counter reaction from the conservative right, which may soon start fighting for a woke free society. And that will set back the progress that postmodernists and wokists actually wanted society to make. It will be 2 steps forward and 5 steps backward. It will undo much of what has been gained, because some of what has been gained is really precious. Unfortunately, even that will get wiped off in this counter revolution or this revolution. The fate of woke activism is one small part of postmodernism, and it's a question just of 5 to 10 years, not more. But postmodernism, in the long history of philosophy, where will it be? Postmodernism will recede to a corner of history because it is not a philosophy in the standard sense of the term. It is more of a salad bowl of ideas and beliefs. And therefore, it will be seen in history of philosophy as a movement to bring in pluralism in Western civilization. For that contribution, postmodernism will be remembered. However, the real pluralism can be brought in only by inculcating the culture from the East, where pluralism is a tried and tested culture for thousands of years. Personally, I believe that holistic open structuralism will replace postmodernism. And one of the theories in psychotherapy, which includes a model of the mind that I have developed, I call it HEAT, Holistic Elemental Analysis and Therapy, and that is based upon holistic open structuralism. Personally, I believe holistic open structuralism will replace postmodernism and will be the operational living philosophy of the future. Thank you.